I need to tell you something. Not because I think you're looking for another message. Not because I think you're waiting for a sign. But because something about your journey stood out to me. And if you clicked on this title, there's a chance you've been feeling something lately that you haven't fully explained to anyone. A strange pull, a quiet discomfort, a feeling that life keeps trying to get your attention, but you can't quite figure out what it's trying to say. And here's the part that might surprise you. I don't think this message is appearing in your life by accident. I think there's a reason you found it today. Because most people ignore the moments that change everything. They don't ignore them because they're careless. They ignore them because they look too ordinary. That's how life works sometimes. The most important turning points rarely arrive with dramatic music. They don't come with flashing lights. They don't announce themselves. They arrive disguised as ordinary moments. A conversation, a feeling, a delay, a coincidence. A thought you can't stop returning to. A door that unexpectedly closed. Or a door that suddenly opened. And I think you've experienced something like that recently. Maybe you haven't even realized it yet. But I think you've felt it. That sensation that something is shifting beneath the surface of your life. The strange feeling that you're standing at the edge of something important without knowing what it is. And the reason I believe this is because I've noticed something about people, especially people who carry more than they show. The strongest people are often the ones who become disconnected from themselves. Not intentionally, just gradually. Life asks them to survive. So they become practical, responsible, focused. They learn how to keep moving. They learn how to carry burdens. They learn how to function. But somewhere along the way, they stop listening, not to other people, to themselves. And eventually something strange begins to happen. The soul starts speaking through discomfort, not because it wants to punish you, because it wants your attention, a restless feeling, an unexplained sadness, a question that won't leave your mind, an old memory that suddenly returns, a longing you thought you had already buried. Most people call these things random, but are they? That's the mystery I want you to sit with for a moment. Because what if some of the things you've been trying to ignore are actually trying to guide you? What if the discomfort isn't the problem? What if it's the signal? Years ago, I heard a story about a sailor crossing a vast ocean. For weeks, everything seemed normal. The skies were calm, the water was peaceful, the journey appeared perfect. But one evening, the sailor noticed something unusual. A slight change in the direction of the wind. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming. Most people would have ignored it, but the sailor didn't. Because experience had taught him something important. The ocean whispers before it roars. And days later, a storm arrived. The tiny signal had been real. The warning had been present long before the danger appeared. I think life works that way too. The soul whispers before it shouts. God whispers before circumstances force us to listen. And that's why I don't think you're here by coincidence. Because maybe something has been whispering to you. Maybe you've been feeling disconnected from the version of yourself you used to be. Maybe you've been questioning a path you've followed for years. Maybe you've been carrying an exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. Maybe you've been wondering why success, achievement, or routine no longer feels the way you expected it would. And maybe you've tried to explain it away. We all do. We're uncomfortable with uncertainty. The human mind loves explanations. It wants simple answers. But life rarely gives simple answers. Instead, it gives invitations. And that's where many people miss the message. Because they spend so much time demanding certainty that they never recognize the invitation. I realized something recently. Some of the most significant moments in a person's life begin with confusion, not clarity, confusion, because clarity often arrives later. The first stage is usually disruption. Something feels different, something feels off, something no longer fits. And because we don't understand it, we try to push it away. We tell ourselves we're overthinking. We tell ourselves we're tired. We tell ourselves it doesn't mean anything. But deep down, another part of us knows. A quieter part, a wiser part, the part that notices what logic can't fully explain. And I think you felt that part speaking recently. Maybe not in words, maybe in feelings, maybe in patterns, maybe in questions that keep returning no matter how many times you dismiss them. That's why I want to ask you something. What have you been pretending not to notice? Not what have you been hiding from other people? What have you been hiding from yourself? Because those are rarely the same thing. Sometimes the thing we're avoiding isn't a fear. Sometimes it's a truth that would require change, a truth that would force growth, a truth that would challenge the identity we've become comfortable carrying. And that's why it's easier to ignore. But ignoring a truth doesn't make it disappear. It simply waits, patiently, quietly, until we're ready to hear it. I think that's one of the most misunderstood parts of faith. People often imagine divine guidance as a dramatic event, a voice from the sky, a miraculous interruption, a sudden revelation. But what if guidance is often much gentler than that? What if it's hidden inside recurring thoughts, persistent feelings, unexpected encounters, closed doors, restless nights, new desires? What if the message doesn't arrive once? What if it keeps arriving until it's acknowledged? Think about that. How many times has life repeated the same lesson before you finally understood it? How many patterns have returned again and again? How many situations looked different on the surface, but carried the same emotional theme underneath? There's a reason for that. Human beings don't usually learn through information. We learn through recognition, and recognition only happens when we're willing to see. I think you've reached a moment where seeing matters, not because everything is about to change overnight. That's not how transformation usually happens. Transformation often begins with awareness. One observation, one realization, one moment where a person finally admits something is trying to get my attention. And once that happens, everything starts to look different. The same events, the same people, the same circumstances, yet somehow nothing feels exactly the same anymore. Because awareness changes the lens through which reality is experienced. And I think that's where you are now. Standing between two versions of yourself, the version that keeps moving on autopilot, and the version that begins paying attention. The interesting thing is that both paths initially look similar. That's why the choice isn't obvious. One path asks you to continue ignoring the whisper. The other asks you to become curious about it. One path offers temporary comfort. The other offers understanding. And understanding is rarely comfortable at first, because understanding reveals things we missed, things we avoided, things we weren't ready to face before. But it also reveals something else, meaning. And meaning changes everything, because once a person begins seeing meaning where they once saw randomness, life starts feeling different. Not easier, different, more connected, more intentional, more alive. I don't think you've noticed this yet, but some of the questions you've been carrying may not be obstacles. They may be invitations. The uncertainty may not be a punishment. It may be preparation. The delay may not be rejection. It may be redirection. And the feeling that brought you here today, the one you couldn't fully explain, the one that made you stop scrolling for just a moment, I don't think it's meaningless. Because sometimes before God changes a person's direction, he changes their attention. Before he opens a new door, he teaches them to notice the one already standing in front of them. Before he reveals the answer, he teaches them how to recognize the question. And perhaps that's what this moment is really about. Not receiving all the answers, not solving every mystery, not understanding the entire path ahead. Just recognizing that something important is asking to be seen. And once a person truly recognizes that, the journey begins. The journey begins with recognition. But recognition alone isn't enough, because noticing something and understanding it are two very different things. Most people reach the point where they realize something feels different. Then they stop, they acknowledge the discomfort, they admit that something inside them is shifting, but they never ask the deeper question, why? Why now? Why this feeling? Why this season of life? Why this message? Why this restlessness that seems to appear out of nowhere? I think you felt this too. That strange experience where everything around you appears normal, but something inside you refuses to settle. You go through your routines, you complete your responsibilities. You smile when you're expected to smile. You answer questions with the usual responses. Yet beneath all of it, something remains unresolved, like a quiet knock on a door you haven't opened. And what makes it difficult is that nobody else can hear it. Other people see your life, but they don't see your internal conversations. They don't hear the questions that visit you at night. They don't feel the weight of the thoughts that arrive when everything becomes quiet. And because nobody else sees it, you sometimes wonder if it's even real. But it is real. In fact, some of the most important changes in a person's life begin invisibly, long before anyone notices them, long before circumstances change, long before outcomes appear. The transformation starts within. That's why understanding matters. Because when you understand what is happening inside you, you stop treating every uncomfortable feeling as an enemy. You begin asking a different question. Not, how do I make this feeling disappear? But, what is this feeling trying to show me? And that question changes everything. I realized something recently. Human beings are remarkably skilled at surviving, far more skilled than they are at listening. When life becomes difficult, we adapt. We push through. We become stronger. We learn how to carry more than we thought possible. But survival comes with a hidden cost. The things we suppress don't disappear, they simply wait. And eventually they return in new forms. A loss of enthusiasm, a sense of disconnection, a persistent feeling that something is missing, a longing we can't name. What makes this fascinating is that many people assume these feelings are signs of weakness. They're not. Often they're signs of honesty, because eventually the soul becomes tired of pretending. Eventually the heart becomes exhausted from carrying things it was never meant to carry forever. And eventually something inside us begins asking for attention. Not because we're broken, because we're human. I think that's one of the reasons loneliness feels so painful. Not physical loneliness, a deeper loneliness. The loneliness of feeling unseen, the loneliness of believing nobody truly understands what you're carrying, the loneliness of being surrounded by people yet feeling disconnected from yourself. That kind of loneliness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind achievement, sometimes it hides behind busyness, sometimes it hides behind success, which is why many people are shocked when they discover it. Everything looks fine, yet something feels absent. And often the thing that's absent is connection, not connection to other people, connection to meaning, connection to purpose, connection to the part of themselves they've neglected for years. Something about your journey stood out to me because I think you've been searching for that connection. Maybe not consciously. Maybe you've never used those words. But you've been searching. The evidence isn't in what you've said, it's in what you've felt. Because people don't search for signs when they're fully connected. They search when something inside them is trying to find its way home. And that brings us to an important truth. The message you're being asked not to ignore may have less to do with information and more to do with alignment. Think about that. What if the purpose of a sign isn't to tell you something new? What if it's meant to remind you of something you've always known? There are moments in life when we don't need more answers. We need reconnection. Reconnection to values. Reconnection to truth. Reconnection to the person we were before fear started making decisions for us. Because fear is subtle. Fear rarely introduces itself honestly. It doesn't say, "Hello, I'm fear." Instead, it disguises itself as practicality, logic, safety, delay, and before we realize it, we've built entire lives around avoiding discomfort. We avoid risks, we avoid vulnerability, we avoid difficult conversations, we avoid possibilities, and slowly our world becomes smaller. Not because life limited us, because fear negotiated away pieces of us one compromise at a time. Then one day we wake up wondering why we feel disconnected. The answer is often simple. We've spent years protecting ourselves from pain, but we've also protected ourselves from growth. And growth requires openness, not certainty, openness. There's a story I once heard about a gardener who inherited an old piece of land. At first glance, the land seemed lifeless. The soil looked dry. Nothing appeared to be growing. Most people would have walked away. But the gardener noticed something unusual. Beneath the surface, tiny green shoots were beginning to emerge. The land wasn't dead. It was preparing. Months later, the entire field became covered with life. Flowers, trees, color, beauty. But none of it appeared suddenly. The growth had started long before anyone could see it. I think people are like that too, especially during seasons of uncertainty. From the outside, it may look like nothing is happening, but beneath the surface, roots are forming. Perspective is changing. Identity is shifting. Understanding is growing. And perhaps that's exactly what's happening in your life right now. Perhaps the reason things feel different isn't because something is ending. Perhaps something is preparing. The challenge is that preparation rarely feels exciting. It feels confusing. It feels slow. It feels uncertain, which is why so many people abandon the process too early. They mistake silence for absence. But silence isn't always absence. Sometimes silence is development. A seed beneath the soil appears inactive, yet beneath the surface, everything is happening. I don't think you've noticed this yet, but many of the moments you've called delays may actually have been invitations to develop qualities you couldn't learn any other way. Patience, trust, wisdom, discernment, compassion. These qualities rarely grow during easy seasons. They emerge during uncertain ones. And uncertainty has a way of revealing who we really are. When everything is predictable, almost anyone can feel confident. But uncertainty exposes our relationship with trust. Not trust in outcomes, trust in the journey itself. Trust that meaning exists even when we can't see it. Trust that not understanding everything doesn't mean we're lost. This is where many people become frustrated. They want immediate clarity, immediate answers, immediate certainty. But life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes understanding arrives gradually, like dawn, not all at once. A little more light, a little more visibility, a little more awareness, until eventually the landscape that once seemed confusing begins to make sense. And when that happens, something remarkable occurs. You stop asking, why is this happening to me? And you begin asking, what is this teaching me? That shift may seem small, but it changes everything, because one question creates helplessness. The other creates wisdom. One assumes life is working against you. The other assumes life may be working for you in ways you don't yet understand. I know that's difficult to believe sometimes, especially when circumstances feel heavy, especially when prayers seem unanswered, especially when the future feels uncertain. But I've noticed something. Many people only recognize the significance of a season after they've moved through it. They look back years later and suddenly understand the heartbreak that redirected them, the disappointment that protected them, the delay that prepared them, the closed door that prevented a greater mistake, the uncertainty that forced them to discover who they really were. What looked like confusion was often guidance wearing a disguise, and that's the deeper understanding beginning to emerge here. The message you're being asked not to ignore may not be an external event. It may be an internal awakening, a growing awareness that you've outgrown old patterns, old fears, old limitations, old versions of yourself. And whenever that happens, discomfort follows. Not because you're moving in the wrong direction, because growth stretches identity. The person you're becoming cannot fully fit inside the assumptions you've carried about yourself. So naturally there is tension, naturally there is uncertainty, naturally there are questions. But questions are not evidence that you're lost. Sometimes they're evidence that you're waking up. And perhaps that's why this message found you now. Not because you needed more information, because you were ready for a deeper understanding. Ready to realize that the restlessness isn't meaningless. The uncertainty isn't random. The questions aren't accidental. They're part of a conversation between who you've been and who you're becoming. And that conversation is about to reveal something far deeper than you expected. There is something I need to tell you. Something most people don't realize until much later. The message you've been sensing may not be trying to change your circumstances. It may be trying to change the way you see yourself. That's the deeper truth, and it's also the reason so many people miss it. Because when we ask God for guidance, we usually expect directions. We expect answers, we expect solutions, we expect a map. But what if the greatest guidance isn't about showing you where to go? What if it's about revealing who you've become? I realized something recently. Many people spend years praying for a different life while secretly carrying an outdated version of themselves. They keep asking for new opportunities, new relationships, new beginnings, new blessings, but they continue seeing themselves through old wounds, old fears, old disappointments, old definitions, and eventually something strange happens. Life starts offering them possibilities they cannot recognize, not because the opportunities aren't there, because their identity can't yet see them. I think you've experienced this before. A moment where you look back and realize something had been right in front of you all along. A lesson, an opportunity, a truth, a blessing. But at the time, you couldn't see it. Not because you weren't intelligent. Not because you weren't worthy. Because you weren't ready. And that realization can be difficult. Because we like to believe that readiness is about external preparation. More knowledge, more money, more confidence, more certainty. But often readiness is internal. It's the moment when a person's perspective becomes capable of receiving what life has been trying to give them. That's why some messages arrive repeatedly. Not because God forgot to send them, because we weren't ready to hear them the first time, or the second, or the third. And maybe that's why this message feels familiar. Maybe some part of you has encountered this truth before, in a conversation, in a disappointment, in a season of waiting, in a quiet moment when nobody else was around. But this time feels different because something inside you is listening differently, and that matters more than you realize. I don't think you've noticed this yet, but the hardest truths are rarely hidden from us. They're hidden inside us. The evidence has always been there. The clues have always existed. The signs have always appeared. Yet we overlook them because they challenge a story we've been telling ourselves. And stories are powerful, not the stories we tell other people, the stories we tell ourselves. The story that says you're not ready. The story that says you've missed your chance. The story that says your mistakes define you. The story that says it's too late. The story that says everyone else is moving forward while you're standing still. The story that says your best days belong to the past. Those stories quietly shape reality, not because they're true, because they're believed. And once a belief settles deep enough, it begins influencing every decision that follows. That's why identity matters. Not as a motivational concept, as a spiritual reality. Because a person will often live according to what they believe they deserve. Think about that. How many opportunities have people rejected because they secretly believed they weren't worthy? How many relationships have been sabotaged because someone expected abandonment? How many dreams have been abandoned before they even began because failure felt inevitable? The tragedy isn't that these people lack potential. The tragedy is that they trusted the wrong story. And maybe that's part of the message you've been receiving. Maybe life isn't asking you to become someone new. Maybe it's asking you to stop believing something false. There's a difference. One requires performance, the other requires truth. And truth has a remarkable quality. It simplifies things, not immediately, but eventually, because truth removes the exhausting burden of pretending. Pretending to be stronger than you are. Pretending not to care. Pretending not to hurt. Pretending not to hope. Pretending not to need healing. I think one of the greatest acts of courage is honesty. Not public honesty, private honesty. The kind that happens when nobody else is watching. The kind that allows a person to finally admit, I'm tired, I'm afraid, I'm disappointed, I'm lost, I'm waiting, I'm hurting. Because healing often begins where performance ends. And perhaps that's why God sometimes allows silence. Not to punish us, to remove distractions, to bring us face to face with ourselves. Most people fear silence because silence reveals things. It exposes what noise has been hiding. Questions, wounds, longings, truths. But silence also reveals something else. The voice you've been unable to hear, the one that gets drowned out by busyness. Comparison, fear, expectations. And when that voice finally becomes audible, a deeper truth emerges. You realize that many of your struggles were never merely external. They were internal conflicts between who you are and who you believed you had to be. That's why some people feel exhausted, even when nothing is physically wrong. They're carrying identities that no longer belong to them, they've outgrown them, yet they continue wearing them, and the soul feels the weight. I once heard a story about an eagle that had been raised among chickens. For years it behaved exactly like the birds around it. It walked where they walked, it ate where they ate, it accepted the limitations they accepted. Then one day it looked up and saw another eagle soaring high above the mountains. Something happened in that moment. Not because the eagle learned something new, because it remembered something old, something true, its nature, its identity, its design. The ability had always existed, the recognition had not. I think that's one of the most powerful moments a person can experience. Not discovering something new, remembering something true, remembering that they are more than their fears, more than their failures, more than their worst season, more than their most painful chapter. And perhaps that's the hidden truth beneath this entire message. The thing God doesn't want you to ignore isn't merely a sign. It isn't merely a coincidence. It isn't merely a feeling. It's a revelation about yourself, a revelation about what you've been carrying, a revelation about what you're no longer meant to carry. Because some burdens were only meant for a season, some fears were only meant for a lesson, some waiting periods were only meant for preparation. Yet people often continue carrying them long after their purpose has ended. Imagine carrying a suitcase filled with stones across a desert. At first the weight might make sense. Perhaps the stones served a purpose. Perhaps they were necessary. But eventually there comes a moment when continuing to carry them becomes unnecessary suffering. And many people never realize they've reached that moment. They keep carrying old guilt, Old shame, old disappointments, old versions of themselves, not because they have to, because they haven't realized they're allowed to set them down. Maybe that's what this message is trying to tell you. Not that your journey is over, not that every question has been answered, not that every struggle has disappeared, but that some of the weight you've been carrying no longer belongs to you. And once that realization arrives, something changes. Not externally, internally. The world looks different. The future feels different. Possibility begins returning, hope begins returning, trust begins returning. Not because circumstances suddenly improve, because perception changes. And perception shapes experience more than most people realize. This is the deeper truth. The message isn't simply about what God wants you to notice around you. It's about what He wants you to notice within you. Because before transformation happens in a life, it usually happens in an identity. Before a new chapter appears externally, a new understanding appears internally. And I think that's exactly where you are now. Standing on the edge of a realization that may explain years of confusion, a realization that may connect pieces you've never connected before, a realization that may finally reveal why this message found you at precisely this moment. And once that realization settles into your heart, nothing will need to be forced. Because truth has a way of changing a person from the inside out. There comes a moment in every meaningful journey when understanding is no longer enough. A person can recognize. A person can understand. A person can even uncover the deeper truth. But eventually, something else must happen. They must decide what to do with it. And I think that's where you are now. Not at the beginning anymore. Not standing in confusion. Not completely lost in uncertainty. You're standing at a threshold. A quiet one. The kind nobody else can see. The kind that exists entirely within a person. Because the greatest transformations rarely happen in public. Nobody applauds them. Nobody announces them. Nobody even notices them at first. Yet they change everything. I need to tell you something that took me years to understand. Transformation isn't becoming someone else. It's becoming honest enough to be who you were meant to be. Most people imagine transformation as addition, adding confidence, adding success, adding opportunities, adding achievements. But real transformation is often subtraction, removing illusions, removing fear, removing false identities, removing expectations that were never yours to carry, removing beliefs that no longer belong in your life. And once those things begin falling away, something extraordinary happens. You start seeing yourself differently, not through the eyes of fear, not through the eyes of failure, not through the eyes of comparison, through truth. And truth changes the way you walk through the world. I think you've already felt the beginning of this, maybe only in small moments. A realization that an old fear no longer controls you the way it once did. A situation that would have devastated you years ago, but now simply teaches you. A disappointment that no longer defines your worth. A delay that no longer feels like proof of rejection. These moments may seem small, but they're evidence of something significant. Growth. Not the loud kind, the lasting kind. Because genuine transformation is almost invisible while it's happening. A tree doesn't hear itself growing. A sunrise doesn't watch itself arrive. And a person rarely notices how much they've changed until they encounter something that once had power over them and realize that power is gone. That's one of the strangest parts of healing. You don't always notice it while it's happening. One day you simply discover that the wound no longer controls the story. The memory remains. But the pain has changed. The lesson remains. But the fear has softened. The experience remains. But your relationship to it is different. And that difference changes everything. I realized something recently. The people who experience the greatest peace are not the people who finally receive every answer. They're the people who stop requiring every answer before they allow themselves to move forward. That's a profound shift. Because many of us spend years waiting for certainty, waiting for clarity, waiting for guarantees, waiting for proof, waiting until fear disappears, waiting until doubt disappears, waiting until the future becomes obvious. But life rarely offers those conditions, and perhaps it was never meant to, because certainty creates comfort. Trust creates transformation. There is a difference, says, I'll move when I know. Trust says, I'll move because I believe. And almost every meaningful chapter in life begins with trust, not certainty. Trust. I don't think you've noticed this yet, but some of the strongest people aren't strong because they have fewer fears. They're strong because fear is no longer making their decisions. That realization changed my perspective completely, because courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the refusal to surrender your future to it. And maybe that's part of the transformation taking place within you. Not that fear has disappeared, not that uncertainty has vanished, but that their authority is fading. They no longer get the final vote. Something deeper does, something wiser, something calmer, something closer to truth. That's what happens when a person begins paying attention to the messages they once ignored. The noise becomes less convincing, the distractions become easier to recognize, the false urgencies begin losing their power, and suddenly life feels different, not because circumstances changed overnight, because awareness did. There's an old story about a traveler walking through a valley at night. The darkness felt overwhelming. Every shadow appeared threatening. Every sound felt dangerous. The traveler moved slowly, convinced that countless obstacles surrounded the path. But then dawn arrived, and with the first light, something remarkable became clear. Most of the obstacles had never existed. The shadows had created them. The darkness had distorted them. The fear had magnified them. And what seemed impossible during the night suddenly appeared manageable in the light. I think many people are living inside that valley, not because they're weak, because fear is persuasive. Fear can make temporary situations feel permanent. Fear can make delays feel final. Fear can make uncertainty feel catastrophic. Fear can make a chapter feel like an ending when it's actually a transition. And that's why transformation begins with light, not external light. Internal light, awareness, perspective, understanding. Truth, because once light enters a situation, you start seeing what was actually there all along. You begin noticing opportunities that fear concealed, strength that doubt ignored, growth that frustration overlooked, guidance that anxiety drowned out. And perhaps that's the transformation this message has been leading toward from the very beginning. Not a dramatic change in circumstances, a profound change in perception. Because perception determines experience more than most people realize. Two people can stand in the same storm. One sees destruction, the other sees cleansing. Two people can face the same delay. One sees rejection, the other sees preparation. Two people can experience the same uncertainty. One sees danger, the other sees possibility. The difference isn't always circumstance, it's perspective. And perspective is transformed by truth. Something about your journey stood out to me because I think you've spent too long interpreting your life through the lens of what went wrong. The disappointments, the setbacks, the unanswered prayers, the losses, the waiting, the confusion. And while those experiences are real, they are not the entire story. They never were. Because every life contains another story running beneath the visible one. A deeper story. The story of resilience, the story of lessons learned, the story of wisdom earned, the story of strength developed, the story of guidance received, the story of becoming. And I think you're beginning to see that story now. Perhaps for the first time. Perhaps in a way you've never seen it before. Not as someone abandoned, not as someone forgotten, not as someone left behind, but as someone being shaped, someone being prepared, someone being transformed. The interesting thing about transformation is that it doesn't announce its completion. There isn't a day when a voice suddenly declares, "You've arrived." Instead, transformation reveals itself through peace, through clarity, through a quieter mind, through stronger trust, through a deeper relationship with uncertainty. Because uncertainty no longer feels like an enemy. It becomes part of the journey, part of growth, part of faith, part of becoming. And perhaps that's the final shift taking place inside you right now. A movement away from resistance and toward acceptance, away from fear and toward trust, away from confusion and toward understanding, away from old stories and toward deeper truths. Not because every question has been answered, but because you've realized something more important. You don't need every answer to keep moving forward. You only need enough truth for the next step. And the next step has always been closer than you thought. Closer than fear suggested. Closer than doubt believed. Closer than uncertainty allowed you to see. Because the message was never far away. It was quietly waiting for the moment you were ready to hear it.